Hello, we're now looking at research and the difference between primary and secondary sources. So, as part of the production process, and specifically part of pre-production, you may well be expected to investigate similar iMedia products and or end user requirements. So essentially you may, as part of this process, be expected to do some research. By research we mean just investigating something and collecting data. So the benefit of investigating similar iMedia products is you can potentially get some ideas, figure out their strengths and their weaknesses. And an end user requirement is different to a client requirement, because a client requirement might be something like, well, they want you to, as part of this process, create a casual video game. Casual video game being sort of a genre, right? You could have a horror video game, you could have a shooter video game. So that's what the client wants. But then the user, the person actually going to be playing the video game once it's created, may have different desires and different requirements. They might want certain things, and you may investigate those using or via research. So in this case, maybe your first part of the research is looking at what similar products exist. So in that genre, what are some successful games and what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses? You may also do some research with end users, perhaps with some interviews, with some focus groups, some surveys, and maybe you figure out that actually what they like about those games is they like the bright colour schemes, that the storylines are quite non-pressured or casual in other words, and they may like the freedom of being able to sort of do their own thing in a game like Sims. And this whole process is called market research. It's quite a businessy term. Looking at the market, what other products exist and what do the users like about those and maybe don't like about them, which you could build on in your own product. So usually this market research will be done before you create any design documents. By those I mean things like mood boards and scripts and storyboards. And that market research may well give you some ideas which you can then take into those more creative designing documentation. But also you can do some research after you've created those documents, maybe a first draft of those documents, in order to get feedback from end users, maybe in a focus group. And then of course you can edit any of your designs based on feedback and then maybe repeat that research process. You can do as much or as little as you feel you need. And there are two main types of research source you need to know about. By source we mean where the information is coming from. So you're investigating something and you're getting information from somewhere, and where is it coming from? Well, a primary source is where this information is collected directly by yourself. So you are going and speaking to someone, collecting information, or the information was collected by somebody else, but it is an original account. So it's had no changes since it was originally collected. A primary source is a first-hand account, in other words. And this contrasts with a secondary source, which is where someone else has summarised or modified or discussed some information which came from that first-hand account, that primary source. So there's been some modification or some change since that original account, which might be fine, right? It might be really useful if it's a collection of different accounts, but there are issues in that it may introduce some errors, it may not be as reliable. It's always good to rely on first-hand accounts, but they may be hard to access sometimes. Now, before I show you some examples, I need to mention a slight area of confusion here, in that we have primary versus secondary sources. We also have a related but different concept of primary research versus secondary research. So primary research is where we are collecting it ourselves, and so we are doing all of it ourselves, right? We're not relying on someone else having had that first-hand experience. It's us collecting it. Whereas secondary research is where someone else has collected information and we are relying on it. So there is a subtle difference between a primary source versus primary research. Of course, one is sort of an object and one is an action, but the action is us doing it ourselves, whereas secondary source is someone else doing it for us. And again, the same issues can pertain to do with things like maybe lack of reliability sometimes. Let me just give you some examples then before we end of primary versus secondary sources. And I should mention it does sort of depend on the context, so it is a bit case by case. You'll need to think on your feet a little bit in the exam, I'm afraid, and of course link any answers to the sort of scenario they give. So a survey or questionnaire is almost always an example of a primary source. You are writing the questions yourself, you are giving them to people, likely in your target audience, you're getting some responses and you can analyse those responses to see what they think. Now the issue with a survey is sometimes, especially if it's given to people and they go away and do it themselves, they may not spend a long time on it, they may not answer it properly, and also you haven't really got an opportunity usually to follow up. Whereas in an interview where you're having a conversation with someone, if they say something interesting, you can then ask them follow-up questions. In a static survey, that's not really possible. Really, an interview which is in a bigger group is a focus group, also called a consumer panel, where we are meeting a bunch of people from your target audience, usually, and getting their opinions as a group. So you're asking the same questions as an interview, but sometimes having more people in the group allows for more diversity, and it's also cheaper and more time efficient. But it can be good to speak in a group because people may sort of disagree with each other, and you may get more interesting responses that way. If you are looking for less opinionated and more just hard stats, government sources are primary sources because they're actually collecting the data, and so there should be no errors, there should be no issues with reliability. An example of a secondary source is using something like a magazine, which may have a bunch of articles in it, and they are relying on first-hand accounts which you can't totally dig into. You may use a magazine like Vogue or a fashion magazine to get some ideas, even of products, even if the actual content is not really what you're looking for. Relying on news reports, so both sort of TV news and also articles, often secondary sources. If it's an investigation and it is totally relying on first-hand accounts, then it may be considered a primary source, but ultimately you're relying on a journalist having interpreted and compiled the information. Using textbooks which summarise information, again, is a secondary source, as is using a search engine. So you don't ever say in an exam a secondary source is Google, because Google is only there to show you results, right? But a secondary source might be different websites you might find via a search engine like Google, maybe looking for inspiration or looking for actual information you can use. And on a similar theme, social media, you may be looking for content on social media, but also just inspiration and other ideas. So that's looking at the sources, and like I say, on a case-by-case basis, they may flip sides sometimes. But a survey, a interview, a focus group would almost always be primary research. It would only be secondary research if someone else did it for you. So you maybe hired someone else, or there was already a study which was done a few years ago. Relying on that would then be secondary research, and it wouldn't then be a primary source either.